Dear friends, today we have with us Senator Dave Sharma, and we are here today to discuss the real spike in energy prices in Australia and what should be the course forward. Dave, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to begin by asking you that Australia now largely imports its liquid fuels. Now, what should be the country's strategy in the long term to reduce the vulnerabilities to these kinds of global supply shocks that we are seeing now? So what should be the long-term strategy, and which is economically viable and competitive as well?
Thank you for your question, and it's a very important question. Look, I think our long-term strategy needs to be to lessen our dependence on imported liquid fuels. And there are several parts to that, I think. Part of that is increasing the supply locally, and bear in mind that only about 20 years ago, Australia produced about 760,000, about three quarters, 760,000 barrels of oil a day equivalent. That's about three quarters of our daily consumption. So not that long ago, we were almost 75% self-sufficient in liquid fuels. Now, some of the oil that we produced in Australia was not refined in Australia, was sent offshore, and in turn we imported refined products. But the point is, not that long ago, we were producing 750,000 barrels of oil a day, and we had 6 refineries operating. Now, today, we produce about 200,000 barrels of oil a day, largely because it's in the Bass Strait, and that field has depleted over time. And we only have 2 refineries operating, one of which in Geelong was taken out of action by a fire. So I think we need to increase our supply of oil domestically, and there are many prospective oil fields in Australia, onshore and offshore, that have been held up or discouraged by the regulatory and legal environment in Australia. We need to get moving on those. There's one particularly in Queensland, which the Queensland LNP state government is keen to move forward. We should be improving our refining capacity. I mean, when the coalition was in government in our last year, we passed something called the Fuel Security Act, which allowed for federal government payments or subsidies, if you like, to refineries to make sure that firstly, those last 2 refineries stayed operational, but secondly, to attract new refineries. Now, the Labor government has not used the tools that are in that legislation to increase our refining capacity at all. I think we need to increase the amount of fuel reserves we hold in Australia, liquid fuel reserves, and a big part of the Coalition's budget reply speech was about increasing our fuel reserves in Australia so we're less vulnerable to supply shocks. And more broadly, I mean, it would be good to see us transition off the dependence on liquid fuels. So, biofuels have a lot of prospect in Australia. Electrification of transportation has promise in Australia. Alternative energy supplies have promise in Australia. So I think there's a whole lot of things we need to do. But as we've seen from this crisis, Australia is one of the most vulnerable to global energy supply shocks at the moment of any developed nation. And it's simply because we haven't been prepared enough.
Yeah. And Dave, how should one balance encouraging domestic production, fuel and gas productions, while we also look at transitioning to lower emission energy sources? So how can that balance be struck?
Look, it is a balance, but I would say that the way Labor has gone about doing it with quite, targets that are so ambitious as to be unrealistic, 80% renewable energy by 2030, halving emissions by 2030. Those targets are simply not feasible with the technologies and the commercial realities we have available to us. And look, around the world, countries around the world are recognising that whilst this transition is important to do, it's going to be a little harder and a little more difficult than they anticipated, and it's going to take a little longer. And I think in Australia we need to be mindful of that. I mean, in some areas, particularly electricity generation and at the household level, we've made quite a bit of progress in terms of electrification, if you like, or shifting to renewables. But some areas, like aviation, like cement production, like transportation, they're going to be much slower to move because the industrial process or the technologies do not yet exist at a commercial scale to be a viable alternative. And so I think, the destination where we want to get to, I think is still clear. But the pathway there and the speed of that transition, I think, is what is rightly an element of public debate in Australia.
Yeah. Now, also, when we talk about refining capacity, as you were mentioning earlier as well, now Australia's refining capacity has actually declined considerably in the last 20 years. Now, how
It has.
important do you think is local refining from a national security point of view? And what can be done there in terms of government policy?
Well, so I think two things, and these are two important policies the coalition has announced. One is to improve stockpiles in Australia. And again, as I said, we introduced what's called the minimum stock holding obligation. It's a legislative requirement for liquid fuels importers and retailers to store a certain amount in Australia. I think that amount needs to be increased, and we will need to provide. The government will need to help underwrite those supplies. But if you look around the world, the United States has a strategic reserve, China has a strategic reserve, Japan has a strategic reserve, Korea has a strategic reserve, India has vast refining capacity. We don't have that in Australia, so I think we need more strategic reserves. But secondly, I think we need to improve the attractiveness for new refining capacity to set up. And Labor's safeguard mechanism in particular, which is designed to reduce emissions, has been discouraging any new refining capacity coming into Australia because the effective carbon tax on that activity is far too high for it to be commercially viable. We need to change that because I think two refineries with one offline is not good enough for a country of 27 million people that's highly advanced and highly integrated with the rest of the world.
Yeah. And as Australia also, like other countries, moves towards cleaner energies, how can it be ensured that this transition is like reliable, affordable, and does not compromise on our energy security?
Well, that's the $1 million question, of course. How can we do all these things at once? And I think the truth is that you need to have a balanced approach, which needs to harness and exploit new technology and help drive the cost of new technology down, which needs to make use of existing fuel sources, including coal and fossil fuel in Australia, which is open to new technologies like nuclear, like biofuels, like coal liquefaction and clean coal technology, and that ultimately respects that consumers and households and industries need to make choices in their own economic interest. So, when cleaner technology or lower emissions technology is cheaper or better or more reliable, that's when people rush to it. And of course, naturally enough, with the spike in fuel prices, we've seen a growing interest in electric cars in Australia, electric vehicles. And I think that's a good thing and a positive thing because if you've got an electric vehicle, you're insulated from the shocks of supply chains. But by the same token, I recognise that, Australian consumers can't change their car fleet overnight or in the next 1 year or 2 years. That would be unrealistic. It needs to happen over time. So I think we need to take a measured and balanced approach to these things. And we need to be, in many respects, technology and agnostic about, which is the best technology. We don't know yet what the future of some of these things are. There's plays on green hydrogen, there's plays on small modular nuclear reactors, there's plays on biofuels, pumped hydro, thermal hydro, all sorts of different new and emerging energy technologies. We shouldn't really be trying to say this is the one way we're going to go. We should let, I think, technology development, private capital, and market and consumer behaviour help us guide us through that transition.
Yeah, and Australia also actually is rich in critical minerals that are required for many of these cleaner energies like batteries and things like that. Now, how can Australia leverage that to its advantages, going forward in the global supply chain? How do you think Australia can leverage that advantage?
Well, look, we do have. So firstly, we have quite an abundantly provided with so-called rare earths, which have an important role in some new energy technologies, in some batteries, in some semiconductors as well, so kind of high-value production manufacturing. Also, we've got big sources or supplies of lithium, which of course is used to provide and source many batteries, but also silver used in solar cells. We also have one of the world's largest reserves of uranium, which is used in nuclear technology too. You know, in Australia, we've historically taken the view that what serves us best is having an open and free market and a trading market in those commodities where we compete and sell in a global market. And generally with Australia's major commodities, whether that's been gold or thermal coal or coking coal, iron or aluminium, that's served us well. But I think increasingly we're seeing that countries are using trade as an instrument of foreign policy, whether it's access to markets or honouring contracts. And I think for those reasons we need to be building closer supply chains with trusted and well-known countries and trading links. So that would include countries such as India, Japan, the United States, Korea, Singapore, where we're making sure that firstly we've got a diversity of markets, we've got a diversity of potential buyers for our products, a diversity of supply, but also resilience in the case of a global shock, that no one single trading partner can bring Australia to its knees economically overnight.
Yeah. And also, if we talk about the refining capacity, we see that, the closures have happened over multiple governments. So it's not one government or the other. So do you think this is like a bipartisan challenge, and that we really need to look at a larger national policy regarding this? Because we see countries like China and India, which are very large economies, they are transitioning to cleaner energy, but at the same time they also have their conventional energy going on for their national security. Is there something that Australia can draw from these countries as to how to transition gradually without actually coming in a situation like this where there's a global supply shock, that impacts the economy this way?
Yeah, look, I think it's a very good question. So I was in China last month. I was in India last year, I think. And what struck me about both of those countries is they have a very diversified energy portfolio, if you like. They're building new coal-fired power plants, but they've also got vast solar and renewable energy and hydropower facilities. They've got some of the most highest uptake of electrified vehicles or scooters in the world. But they're also, both countries are building nuclear technology and nuclear power plants. So, they have significant sovereign capability, whether it's in the production of coal themselves, like in China, or refining capacity, such as in India. So they sort of, to be honest with you, I think they've taken an attitude that energy abundance and a diversified energy mix is critical to national success. And I think that's an important lesson that Australia can learn. I think the lack of energy abundance in Australia, I mean, it was a structural feature in Australia for most of our industrialised history, that Australia had some of the lowest energy costs in the world. And that feeds through to all sorts of competitive advantages, whether it's in manufacturing or agriculture or transport. These days, Australia has some of the highest electricity unit costs in the developed world, and that is a competitive disadvantage. And I think we need to take a leaf out of the books of countries like China and India, in the sense that we should be taking an all of the above approach to potential energy supplies. One thing I would say, and it goes back to the start of your question, that's changed from 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the world was more stable, was more predictable. There were no significant major power conflicts raging. The relations between the globally significant powers were largely harmonious. And 10 years ago, I think Australia could, and other countries could, rely on global supply chains to largely meet their needs and count on a lack of interruptions to those supply chains. Now, in the last 10 years, we've had a global pandemic, we've had a major war in the Middle East, we've had a major war in Europe, we've had increasingly tense relations between the world's two largest economies. So it's a different world. Our ability to rely upon global markets and global supplies to meet our needs is different to what it was 10 years ago. So whilst it might have been fine 10 years ago for Australia to have only 2 refineries, for instance, I think today we're in a different era, and our attitude needs to change accordingly.
Yeah. And last question, Dave, that how do you see the current situation unfolding? Do you think that the worst is over, or do you reckon that, if this conflict in Iran is not resolved soon enough, that it's going to have a major impact on the Australian economy going forward? Where do you see this situation ending?
Well, firstly, I would say that the worst is certainly not yet over, or potentially not over. I mean, um, we've seen an increase in prices, but we haven't really seen, in Australia at least, a significant shortage for a prolonged period. We're still getting supplies, but global reserves are getting depleted. Liquid fuels at sea that were at sea at the time the conflict with Iran started have now largely, docked, unloaded, gone to berth, and we've still got a huge amount of oil basically fenced in the Strait of Hormuz. And so I think if the conflict is not resolved, if the Strait of Hormuz is not reopened, then the supply shock will get worse. And people and analysts and bodies like the International Energy Agency are saying we could see the price of the benchmark, Brent crude, for instance, reaching $170, $180 a barrel as opposed to 110 or 120. So I think this crisis could get worse, and we shouldn't be complacent about that just because the shock has been manageable in a country like Australia up until now. I think it is very important that it's resolved, but I don't pretend it's easy to resolve. I think the United States and Iran are still quite far apart in their bottom line negotiating positions, I think. That's the task of diplomacy to overcome that, but I don't underestimate how big a task that is.
Dave, thank you so much for taking out your time, and hopefully we'll continue with our conversations. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you.